It's my pleasure to introduce Martin Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal and also the co-founder of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. So thank you very much for joining us, Martin, and welcome to this first GNOSIS Annual Conference. It's a pleasure to have you with us, at least virtually, to discuss space sustainability. And I'm sure a lot of the topics that we'll cover will crop up over the next couple of days as part of the conference. So I'd like to jump in, if I may, with our first question. That is, what in your opinion is the major risk, if you like, associated with the growing activity in space?
Well, of course, the main figure is the number of spacecraft that are going to be in orbit. There are going to be about 100,000 in orbit by the end of the decade, and that's going to include 42,000 as part of the SpaceX Starlink project, and about 12,000 Chinese ones as well, etc., in addition to all the other efforts in space. And of course, we have several thousand spacecraft in orbit now, and more importantly, we have thousands of dead ones which are still in orbit. And I think the key concern, obviously, is that the more there are, the more risk there is of the collision. And of course, as we'll be hearing in the conference, there's a big concern that there could be a runaway effect, which could eventually make low Earth orbit unusable. So that's the most obvious concern. And so one needs to minimize the probability of collisions between spacecraft. And of course, there's another more scary possibility, which is that nations are talking about space weapons and warfare in space. And this includes kinetic weapons, where you crash a spacecraft intentionally into another. The Chinese famously did a test of this kind of thing a few years ago, which led to a huge amount of debris. And we want to ensure that that sort of event doesn't happen again.
Yes, as you mentioned, Martin, the catalogue's getting even bigger by the day, and that's something that certainly with our space surveillance and tracking facilities is really becoming a strain on what we can actually achieve at the moment. So yeah, I would certainly agree with you there. So in your opinion, whose responsibility is it to keep space sustainable? And I guess we can split that into the past and also the future in terms of where that side of things is going, in your view.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think if we think of the Starlink project, which is run by SpaceX, I think it's clear that they are responsible. They're doing their best. And quite apart from the issue of collisions leading to debris, as you probably know, there's concern among astronomers about the effect of all those spacecraft up there, because, of course, they can all be seen moving across the sky, and it's a detriment to certain kinds of astronomical observations, survey telescopes, which are trying to look for variable objects, etc., are confused by these. And so the one benefit, in a sense, is that because they're in low orbit, you only detect them after dusk and before dawn, and so you have not all night. But the Starlink people are aware of this, and they're trying to paint the spacecraft black and avoid reflecting surfaces, etc. So they're doing their best. But there's another issue which astronomers worry about from Starlink, which is more serious, and this is that the radio signals from them all come down to Earth, and this is happening day and night. And so, although I'm not particularly clued up on this, this is something which I think radio astronomers and all other users of the radio bands are going to have to worry about. So that's one concern. And I think one has to engage with the large companies. Starlink is the largest, but there are other companies which are going to be launching large numbers. Another which is launching 7,000, Amazon launching 3,000, etc. So I think we've got to rely on the goodwill of those companies, which are at least run by people who at least understand the issues and the scientific importance. But of course, the more scary possibility is the intentional use of anti-satellite weapons, etc. Because, of course, in high Earth orbit, we depend crucially on satellites, and they can be attacked. And I think one needs to ensure that there are the maximum kinds of legal constraints on this. It's hard to get government to agree because it's like the law of the oceans, which of course has to be international. And this is an issue which has to be addressed in the context of space. But that's a big challenge. The lawyers will benefit from it, but I guess no one else.
Absolutely, yes. And you mentioned the issue of constellations and their effect on astronomy, and that's something that will actually come up on the second day of the conference quite heavily. So anybody in the audience who's watching that may be interested in that side of things, please do check out the program for the second day, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunities to look into that further. And I think this is a good opportunity as well. I know something that you're very passionate about is the light pollution side of things, and you've mentioned that you know there's activity in the House of Lords with regards to that. I wondered if you could expand on that for our audience.
Yes, if I might, it's slightly off the main theme of this conference, of course, but light pollution is something which it concerns astronomers. But one point I'd like to make is that it shouldn't just concern astronomers for two reasons. First, light pollution is a waste of energy. It's also, as we've learned, something which affects the natural world, because if there's no proper darkness, it affects the way various species evolve. But I think more important than that, we should realize that the dark night sky is part of the human environment. It's been something which has been viewed by all human beings in all parts of the world throughout history. It's the one common part of our environment. And it's rather sad that many young people today grow up never seeing a dark sky. And if they live in towns, they never see a dark sky, just as they never see a bird's nest. And that's rather sad in both cases. And that's why it's important to try and reduce light pollution. And of course, there are areas of the country, the Brecon Beacons and Northumbria, etc., where they are trying to have areas where you try especially hard to preserve dark skies. But the point I'd like to make is that it's broader than an astronomical issue. And to give an analogy, I'm not an ornithologist, but I would certainly miss it if there were no songbirds in my garden. And similarly, you don't need to be an amateur astronomer to feel that you're missing something if you never see a dark night sky. So that's why I think it's good if we do try and ensure that we minimize the pollution from floodlights, etc., and street lights that are on unnecessarily.
Absolutely. I think, yes, as someone that's grown up in the city, the first time I went to the observatory in La Palma, that was quite a revelation, really,
Yes.
to see.
And the reason I wanted to mention that is that there's a bill going through Parliament, the Environment Bill, and there have been amendments made, particularly on the issue of light pollution as part of this rather long and elaborate Environment Bill. So this is a time when legislators have at least been made aware that it's an issue that many people care about.
Yes, yes. So I guess moving back to the sort of main theme of our discussion, what would you say is the role of the scientific community in preserving the space operating environment?
Well, I mean, obviously, we should use our personal contacts with people in these companies like SpaceX, etc., to ensure that they're mindful of these concerns. And I think, as in any issue which needs government action or political action, then we should bang on and promote the concerns, because we can talk among ourselves, but it's more important that we use public figures and charismatic figures to get press attention and to get public attention, because politicians don't listen very much to expert advisors except in emergencies like COVID-19. I know lots of people who've been advisors in government departments, and since politicians have lots of urgent things to worry about, it's hard to get their attention to long-term issues. But they do care about what's in the inbox and what's in the press. And so I think if one can do what one can to ensure that there is press coverage of these issues about the risks to space, then that's important. And of course, it is a serious issue because it's almost irreversible. Once you've got too much debris in low Earth orbit, it's true that there are clever techniques to put a piece of netting around the big bits and drag them down, but that can't be done with the small bits, which can still be dangerous. And so I think we've just got to make sure that this is something which all those who are involved and the administrators and the military are aware of the issue. And that's why this conference is a good start. And I hope you get a bit of publicity for it in the press.
Thank you very much. We hope so too.
Yeah.
So along similar lines, sorry. I guess you talk about building those connections and making sure that we're getting that publicity. How can the different sectors work together? So industry, government, academia all have big parts to play, of course, in tackling this issue. How can they work together better to tackle this problem and keep space safe and sustainable?
Well, I think it's important that when we consider any satellite launch that we're involved in, then obviously one should consider what's going to happen in the long run. Is the spacecraft in low Earth orbit that it will degrade safely, or is it in a high orbit, in which case we needn't worry so much about it. So I think we've got to be concerned if we are involved in satellite launches. And I think in addition to the very large constellations we've mentioned, there are small satellites which aren't quite so large in number, which are important. I mean, for instance, I know quite well the company Planet Lab, run by Will Marshall, a Brit who used to be at Leicester. And what they do is they launch satellites about the size of a fridge. They launched about 70 of them in one Indian rocket. And these are monitoring the Earth. They are scanning the Earth, and their mantra is to observe every tree in the world every day. And they can more or less do this. And this is, of course, valuable data. And so I mention this because these are satellites which are slightly different from the constellations used for internet coverage. But also, it's important that they are concerned about the fate of these because they're rather short-lived spacecraft. So that's one point. But I think we should consider the international dimension, and particularly the threat of space weaponry is something which is a long-term concern, and that can only be legislated by some international agreements. So I think at bodies like the G7, it would be nice to see that that's at least on the agenda. And I think it's not hopeless to do that because from what I know about these big international meetings, it's often very hard for them to agree on the most important issues to them. So it's often nice if they have something which they can agree on, even though it may be in a sense minor. And so I think the possibility, if there is one, to put on the agenda for big international meetings something connected with keeping space safe, as it were, is a good idea and worthwhile.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's a good opportunity to move on to the G7 summit. Obviously, it took place in Cornwall earlier this summer. So that at that time, the delegates did actually pledge to take action to tackle the growing hazards of orbital debris and congestion in space. Do you think that would be a key driver for a wider adoption of existing mitigation guidelines? That's obviously a problem that's existed for quite a number of years. And in what way do you think this will help in boosting efforts from a policy perspective?
Well, that's the most recent example of what I was saying, that at every meeting like that, it's important to try and get this issue on the agenda because as the previous G7 showed, it's slightly easier to get agreement on that than on the other things which they didn't get agreement on. So I think it's important to do this, and also to ensure that one can get through to those who are concerned with the military uses of space, which of course is a more closed world to most of us.
Absolutely, and I had a question relating to UKRI, who do support GNOSIS in a form of we're a 21st century challenge network. So looking to bridge that gap between academia and industry and bring different researchers together to tackle this issue. So with that in mind, if UKRI is to be involved in this area, how can they empower the scientific community to get more involved and to tackle this issue?
Well, I think they are facilitators because it's bodies like STFC, which are more hands-on, and they should let STFC make the relevant decisions, and also perhaps Innovate UK, which has some links with industry. But I think it can best be done perhaps by individual contact within the UK, because there are many of us who know some people who work for the space companies, and I think that's a way we can have some influence.
So just to bring us to the close now, Martin, you were the co-founder of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, and of course this sort of topic of orbital debris and congestion in space is unlikely to be an existential risk for humanity, but certainly for human society it could have quite the impact. So I wondered if we could get your perspective on that.
Yes, well, of course, it's not, as you say, an existential risk, because we have lived very happily without space until 50 years ago, and so we could again. But I think we've got to realize how much we do depend on space technology for communications, obviously, for sat-nav and GPS, and for environmental monitoring, and for weather prediction and all the rest. And if low Earth orbit or geostationary orbits became so clogged up with debris that they couldn't be safely used, this would be a detriment to our present lifestyle. So it would be something that we should feel motivated to try and avoid, even if it's not an existential risk, obviously.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time, Martin, and it's been great to talk to you. Yeah, it's been great to hear your insights on the topic. So I'll now be handing back to Don, who will be slightly in the future for us, but at the time for the conference, he'll be introducing the program for day one. So I'll hold the recording.
Well, thank you very much, and best of luck with the rest of the conference.
Thanks very much, Martin.